Now I'd like to turn it over to the Director of Efficiency Vermont, Rebecca Foster, to share a few opening words. Welcome, Rebecca.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome virtually to BBD 2021. I am definitely looking forward to a time when I can welcome you all to an event in person and looking forward to everything that will mean about where we are as a state. But I am very glad no one is on the roads this morning, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to gather with you all virtually. To take a few days to step back from our work, celebrate what we've achieved together, and grow our knowledge for the work that we need to achieve in the future. Last spring, many of you were sent home from work with projects partially completed, unsure if you'd be able to come back to finish them. In-person meetings switched to virtual, and the ability to restart work in homes and businesses became uncertain. Some of you were and are essential employees that kept working through the shutdown, ensuring that the heating systems continued operating through a late spring. And as the economy reopened, you learned how to embed new safety protocols as you got back to work, helping Vermonters with their energy and cost savings projects and keeping the health and safety of customers front and center while you also save them money, something that's more important than it ever was before. Many of you balanced homeschooling children and helping them navigate virtual classrooms. You set up new work from home options at a dining room table, in a bedroom, or on the couch. And your resilience in navigating all of this uncharted territory is really part of what inspired the theme for this year's Better Buildings by Design, Resilient Energy. Your resilience inspires all of us to think about how we can make Vermont a more resilient place for all of our communities. Resilient energy includes designing and constructing more efficient buildings that keep occupants safe and healthy no matter what comes their way. It's also about using buildings to create a flexible, more resilient electric grid. And it's about preparing for worsening storms, extreme temperatures, and helping businesses and customers build economic resiliency by lowering their monthly energy costs. Not only did each of you demonstrate resilience throughout this last year, but the work that you've done has helped homeowners and businesses strengthen their own resilience. You'll hear more about resilient design from this morning's keynote speaker, Candace Pearson, in just a few minutes. But first, I'd like to invite you to take a few moments to celebrate the partners and projects that demonstrated resilience during COVID this past year. We'll be sharing a few videos celebrating our best of the best winners for commercial new construction and the Energy Efficiency Excellence Network Awards. We'll share another video during tomorrow morning's opening session featuring the residential new construction winners. To learn more about all of these projects and speak with the winners, I invite you all to join the roundtable discussion tomorrow at 1:30. Now let's see the videos of the winners today. Now, please join me in congratulating these winners and celebrating the excellent work that all of you accomplished this year. If we were together, we would give a great big round of applause, but I do hope that you'll reach out, using the networking features of Pathable to congratulate the winners and to learn more about their work. I'd like to spend the next few minutes just orienting you to the conference itself. As you plan your agenda out over the next few days, there are 4 types of sessions that you can take advantage of. First, there are general sessions, which include an opening session today and tomorrow, and then a closing plenary on Thursday. Second, each morning there are concurrent educational sessions. These sessions focus on what energy resilience means when it comes to building design, grid integration, and our most vulnerable. Third, there are shorter product-specific trainings led by manufacturers Wednesday and Thursday mornings. And lastly, each afternoon, you can join roundtable sessions for smaller conversations about a specific topic or theme. Continuing education credits are available for the concurrent sessions. And if you're hoping to earn CEUs during the conference, you can visit the CEU information page in Pathable. As you engage with the conference website over the coming days, please don't forget to visit our sponsors. Head to the sponsor engagement section of the site and click on each company's logo to learn more about their work and to connect with their representatives. There are also a variety of ways attendees can earn points throughout the conference if you're the competitive type. Some examples include joining a sponsor's virtual booth, watching a presentation, accepting a meeting request, posting a message to a discussion group, participating in a poll, or more. Prizes will be awarded to the top 3 eligible participants, and winners will be notified on Friday. So finally, before I close, I have some gratitude to share. As always, BBD would not be possible without the team behind the scenes. And that includes the BBD Planning Committee, Delaney Meeting and Event Management, and the Efficiency Vermont staff who work all year to put this conference together and organize the sessions you're about to attend. Thanks to all of them for all of the work that they've done, including adapting to our new virtual environment this year. I also want to thank our sponsors, without whom we could not host this event. This year in particular, I'd like to thank sponsors for investing in our industry at a time when it's absolutely essential and helping us bring this conference together virtually. Again, the sponsor engagement section of the Pathable website will provide you with more information, and we hope you consider visiting our sponsors and using their products in your projects. And now I'm pleased to welcome one of our sponsors, Mark Toth from Renew Air LLC and RST Thermal, to share a few words of welcome with you. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Good morning. My name is Mark Toth. I'm with RST Thermal. We're a manufacturer's rep for multiple different heating and air conditioning items, including Renew Air, who is sponsoring this event today. We are a company that covers all of New England. I personally cover New Hampshire and Vermont for Renew Air and our other products. I work closely with contractors, engineers, and distributors to help people with their ventilation questions and needs for everything from a small home to large commercial buildings. And I think everyone here would agree that we'd all rather be in person, but it is a new world we're working in, and hopefully we can have a good couple of days here. Please stop by my booth, send me a text, send me an email, anything you like, and we can talk about our fine products and set up an in-person meeting or a job site visit if you need to. Thank you very much and enjoy your day.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Rebecca, for setting up the introduction so well. I am very pleased to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, who is Candace Pearson. Candace is in-house counsel and senior analyst for BuildingGreen, Inc., a nationally renowned education and consulting company for sustainable design located in Brattleboro, Vermont. Her keynote today will focus on multi-solving through resilient design, addressing our co-crises of climate, equity, and health. Welcome, Candace.
Hello, good morning, everyone. So let me just transfer to my presentation here. All right, so thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Rebecca. Again, my name is Candace Pearson. I'm a research analyst at BuildingGreen, based down here in Brattleboro, Vermont. And for my resilience work, I work most often with our sister organization, the Resilient Design Institute. So I'm really excited to be here at this conference. This is Better Buildings by Design is one of those conferences that kind of fills my cup for the year. And I love being around Vermonters that are working on such complex issues. So I'm excited that we can still get together virtually here. As we've said, the theme for this year's conference is resilient energy. I know after this session, I'll be heading straight to a session on grid interactive homes. But I'm also really excited that this conference includes fascinating sessions on anti-racism, indoor air quality, and energy efficiency. And I think that's really representative of the fact that this past year and a half has just pummeled us with these multiple overlapping crises in health, climate, and equity. And it feels like there's a lot of things to solve. So I've been thinking a lot about how we integrate these different priorities, and that's going to be my topic today on multi-solving through resilient design. So I want to start by acknowledging that for every punch 2020 gave us, buildings are in some way really central to the needed response. Many of you probably experienced that the pandemic completely elevated the need for good ventilation and indoor air quality. Global warming became really visceral this past year and a half. So terms like net zero energy and zero carbon buildings are really now part of the public consciousness. The Black Lives Matter movement brought long overdue attention to the fact that we haven't put enough effort into making sure the benefits of green building reach communities of color. And finally, we saw buildings being stressed as they cope with more extreme disasters, and we haven't adequately prepared with resilient design. So as practitioners who care about all of those things, I think that can feel like a lot to juggle. Maybe if you're being honest, it might feel like you're being pulled in different directions. And since resilient design is one of the newer concepts here, I think it can sometimes feel especially fuzzy or less manageable. So my focus for today is going to be, how do we define resilient design with greater specificity? How does it fit in with all of these other priorities around sustainability, health, and equity? And how do we identify our area of scope as building practitioners? So first is defining resilient design with specificity. And I should say a little bit more about why I think that's needed. This was a project that I recently worked on, excuse me, in DC. And it was a school modernization project called Smothers. And I pulled a little bit of the requirements from the RFP here just to kind of demonstrate what we were dealing with. So the first section in the RFP had a bunch of criteria around sustainability. So they were looking at doing a net zero energy school. They were looking to come up to stormwater regulations. And then there was a second section on social equity. And that was really focused around engaging and supporting the community and creating a safe space for school programming. Then there was a third section on health. So this project was considering the well rating system. And what didn't even make it into the RFP, but came up later, was that they also wanted the school to be resilient. But this was all, right? There was no other descriptors besides that. And I think that's really common. So one of the things we try to be really clear about at RDI is what we mean by resilient design. And this is the definition we use: a building that has the capacity to adapt to changing conditions and maintain or regain functionality and vitality in the face of stress or disturbance. So what I want to highlight about that definition is that we're really talking a level above current codes. Codes focus on life safety. So if you're looking at seismic risks, that can mean as little as not collapsing in time for people to evacuate. So if we're not okay with our buildings being disposable like that, then we really need some level of resilience. And that's this ability to maintain or regain functionality. But even then, it's a spectrum, right? So maybe your client just wants to minimize damage so that they're not shelling out money every time there's a disaster. Or maybe you're working with a business that's really concerned about downtime and getting back up and running as soon after a disaster hits. Or maybe you're working with a nursing home, and those are constantly really hard to evacuate. So maybe it's a priority to maintain livable conditions so that people can stay in place during a disaster. The point is, identifying where your client or your project is on the spectrum is really the first step into making resilience specific as you're trying to tackle that in your design. The second step to getting specific about resilient design is understanding hazards. So I pulled some information from the Vermont State Hazard Mitigation Plan, which identifies these as Vermont's top hazards. I'm just going to quickly go through them one by one here. So by far, Vermont's greatest hazard is around increased precipitation. And that's because our extreme rain and snow events have been getting worse over the last 70 years. And with climate change, they're expected to keep getting worse. So if you look at just the top 10% of precipitation events from 1949 to 2010, This map shows how much the average precipitation has changed. So in north central Vermont, precipitation has increased from 60 to 100% in those extreme rain or snow events. There are some places in Vermont, like along the shores of Lake Champlain, where precipitation has decreased, maybe around 15%, but that's not what's happening across the majority of the state. And of course, this is only looking historically, right? So if climate projections indicate that these heavy precipitation events, maybe 3 inches of rain or more, will increase in frequency from once every 7 years to once every 2 or 3 years by 2050. So when we get these extreme precipitation events, we get damage in 2 ways. One is fluvial erosion and one is inundation flooding. And fluvial erosion is what happens when a stream or a river is changing course because there's so much water flowing down it. And interestingly, fluvial erosion can cause more dollars in damage than inundation flooding. So if we looked back at Irene, 75% of the costs associated with the damage from Irene was actually from fluvial erosion, not inundation. So we can't just start building like beach style elevated buildings. We actually have to really consider the stability of our soil here in Vermont. The next hazard is around extreme heat. So that's something we're probably not as used to thinking about in Vermont, but in 80 years, our summers are gonna look more like summers do in Miami today. Another way to look at this is that Vermont currently has about 10 days a year where heat exceeds dangerous levels, but by 2050, that'll be 50 days a year. So extreme heat is actually gonna become an issue for us. We are more used to thinking about the winter storms like the one we're seeing today. And I'm lumping here together ice, cold, and snow. And even though I just said average temperatures will increase, it's possible that the severity and intensity of these winter storms will also increase. And that's one of the reasons is that ice tends to be more of a problem than snow. So with fluctuating temperatures, ice storms could be more of a problem. So we could see more storms like the one we saw in 1998, which led to 3 inches of ice in many locations across Vermont. Power was out for 10 days, and it was actually part of the same storm system that killed 28 people in Quebec. It didn't kill any people here, but these storms have a really big potential to do a lot of damage. There's also a hazard around wind. So this could be wind from hurricanes, thunderstorms, windstorms, or tornadoes. But it does bring up the need for us to think about continuous load paths and making sure that our buildings are durable for those kind of stresses. And then finally, the last hazard is around drought. A lot of people think that this is going to affect more of our agricultural sector, but it can have impacts on our building sector as well. So these are 2 droughts, one from 2001 and one from 2016. And this just shows that when we do get droughts, it covers a really broad swath of Vermont. And that's worth thinking about, especially because so many of people live in rural places and rely on our wells. So that's, there are also some non-climate hazards that we might want to think about tying to resilient design. And these are just some that I think are really relevant here in Vermont. Power outages are super common here, and they often accompany other weather disasters, potentially leaving people freezing in their homes. In southern Vermont, we have the Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Plant. It's decommissioned, but they're still storing nuclear waste. Some parts of Vermont have experienced PFA contamination in drinking wells, so water supply has been kind of compromised. And then of course, the pandemic this year, that's also a resilience opportunity. So with that kind of background knowledge about what kind of hazards are prevalent in Vermont, the next step is to look at your specific site and analyze what the vulnerabilities are and what the strategies are from there. There's not enough time here to go through every single kind of resilient design strategy, but a typical one is if you've got a house on a floodplain or near a floodplain, you'll need to address flooding. So you might look into elevating it or wet floodproofing the first floor. For more guidance, there are rating systems that provide really good guidance on how to do this. And I know certifications aren't super common in Vermont, but using those frameworks as resources can be really useful. So I just want to highlight a few of those that I found kind of out in the marketplace. the fortified rating systems are a great entry-level rating system because they're kind of built to be code plus. They're most well known for their hurricane and wind standards, and they're used a lot kind of in the southeast part of the US where hurricanes are prevalent. But they also have a multi-hazard standard that addresses hazards like flooding and severe winter weather. So that's a great kind of entry-level one. There are also resilient design pilot credits in the LEED rating system, which is familiar to a lot of people. And one of the strengths of those pilot credits is that there's a methodology for designing for passive survivability. So I'm gonna talk more about what that is, but just know that you can refer to LEED if you're interested in that. There's also the RELY rating system, which is an entire rating system for resilience. And I think one of its kind of strong points is its emphasis on social resilience. So if you're interested in that, it's a good place to go. And then there are two rating systems for earthquakes, USRC and READY, and both are looking to expand their programs to other hazards. So I'm kind of keeping an eye on what they come up with. And I think both of them, flooding is going to be next on their list, and probably wind. So those are all ways, and those are all things I advocate for clients to get specific about what they mean when they're talking about resilient design. I think it's just so important to make resilient design as substantive and tangible as we talk about sustainability. It should be just as tangible as those things. Next, I want to highlight a few resilient strategies that I think are particularly impactful. And one of the reasons I think they're really effective is that they multi-solve. And that's a term from Climate Interactive, which describes actions that achieve one goal, like disaster resilience, while also bringing other co-benefits, like improving health, the economy, or social justice. So these kind of strategies can basically be justified from any angle because they add value from so many fronts. And if you're the kind of person who's concerned about financial payback, the returns here are kind of compounded if you're willing to look at your returns holistically. So I have 4 examples of resilient strategies that I believe multi-solve, and some projects that have implemented those strategies. And before I dive in, I just want to acknowledge that most of my examples are from schools or public buildings. And that's because those type of buildings are often designated as emergency shelters or resilience hubs. So it's really easy to kind of to justify resilience upgrades there. But also I believe Krista Egger will speak more to multifamily buildings in tomorrow's keynote. So hopefully we'll be covering a lot of bases between us. Okay, so the first multi-solving resilience strategy I want to talk about is solar electric systems with islanding capabilities, so coupled with some battery storage. And of course, these provide a great resilience benefit because you're able to island and maintain power in the event of a power outage. And according to Green Mountain Power, batteries through its programs provided 16,000 hours of backup power to customers just this year in 2020, or last year. But of course, there are other co-benefits from these systems too. For sustainability, you have carbon emission reductions, even when the grid isn't down, because you're either using renewable energy instead of gas or oil furnaces, or you're generating renewable energy for a cleaner grid mix. Plus, there's the opportunity to use batteries for load shifting. So here in Vermont, GMP has programs that tap into home battery systems during energy peaks. And that allows it to avoid turning on those expensive and dirty peaker plants. So that saved GMP customers $3 million in 2020, but it also comes with CO2 savings. In terms of health, these kind of systems replace the need for backup diesel generators. And those generate really terrible air pollution. They can cause carbon monoxide poisoning, and they require fuel storage, which raises the risks of explosion. So of the 15 deaths caused from Hurricane Laura this past September, 8 of them were attributed to carbon monoxide poisoning from portable diesel generators. Finally, there's also potentially some equity benefits here if these kinds of systems are actually targeted towards those most in need of resilient power. Communities that are most at risk for climate change also tend to be low income or communities of color. And these systems would bring secure backup power to those communities while extending the financial benefits of solar energy ownership. But again, we only get that equity benefit if we actually get those systems into underserved communities. So there's kind of a big disclaimer there. As an example of this, there's a community in Lafarge, Wisconsin, which was flooded in 2018. And the local electric co-op's generator and substation was completely flooded in that event. And afterwards, so all of the power went out into town. And afterwards, the utility refused to move the substation to higher ground. So the town ended up mobilizing and installing 7 grid-tied power walls at 3 different locations. And what I think is like the best aspect of this is that they installed 2 of them at the town library. And you see in the picture here, it's also coupled with a PV array, and it's able to island. So I think this is so great because they made sure that this system was going to be at an accessible location where anyone can access it, which really helps kind of equalize the access to this kind of backup power that's so crucial. The second strategy that I found kind of does this multi-solving is landscaping for heat. So for me, this includes vegetative shading, increasing tree canopy, and planting with native species. And all of this provides a resilience benefit of reducing indoor air temperatures passively so that we can keep people safe even if it's the peak of summer and there's a power outage. Of course, there's a sustainability benefit here because that vegetation reduces CO2 and bolsters biodiversity. There's a health benefit because you're improving outdoor air quality, and you're also providing some sound buffering, which can result in some productivity benefits. In terms of equity, that increased vegetation cleans the air, which can mitigate disproportionate asthma rates. And also lower income communities are less likely to have air conditioning. So they're more in need of outdoor spaces of reprieve. So I think if we can make those shaded spaces publicly accessible, there could be an equity benefit there too. My example of this is Smothers Elementary. I already mentioned this project once before, but this school was thinking about expanding their playground area. So they were actually thinking about putting kind of a second playground on the roof of this, on the roof of the building that kind of you see in the background here. And we knew urban heat island was going to be a problem. So we were able to advocate that this lower playground should be under a pavilion, a shaded pavilion. And once that kind of came up, then it opened up this dialogue. Well, maybe we can put a PV array on the top of the shade pavilion, especially given the fact that we're going to be taking some roof space away for the second playground. So it's just a great example of being able to pair a resilience strategy with a sustainability strategy. The third multi-solving strategy is coined by my colleague, Alex Wilson, and it's called passive survivability. So that's the ability of a building to maintain habitable temperatures if it loses power or heating fuel for an extended period of time. This is often described in the context of Hurricane Katrina, when it became really clear that more modern buildings built for air conditioning quickly overheated when the power was out for so many days straight. But the historic buildings that were built with these wraparound porches and really high windows were much easier to ventilate. So they stayed cool after Hurricane Katrina. In the Vermont context, high performance building envelopes are really what's needed to float temperatures like that during a power outage. So you can think of kind of like passive house level envelopes, right? Proper building orientation can also help passively cool and heat, and good daylighting and operable windows are also crucial here to make the space livable without power. By the way, there looks like there's a great session tomorrow that might be kind of really relevant here. It's new construction and retrofit case studies and resiliency, which is focusing on building enclosures. So I think that might be I'm going to be attending. And the co-benefits around these strategies are really the co-benefits of green buildings in general. Of course, a high performance building envelope reduces energy consumption over the lifetime of the building. So that's saving CO2. Access to outdoor air and natural light has health and productivity benefits. And in terms of equity, a high performance building with low energy bills means even more to low income residents because they spend a larger portion of their income on energy costs. But again, the disclaimer applies here. Those equity benefits only come into play if those building practices are brought to at-risk communities. So the example of this that I've seen in play is from Vernonia High School. So this high school was designed to be an emergency center and a community center and a school all wrapped in one. And during an emergency, the facility is designed to house the entire population for up to a week. So the building was really detailed with a really well insulated envelope to float temperatures like I'm talking about with passive survivability. It also has really great daylighting. You can see how much daylighting is even brought into this multi-use gym space. It also has some backup power features, which I think are just worth mentioning because they're relatively nuanced. This project used a pellet-fired boiler, which used waste sawdust from the local plywood mill, so a really local source that they could use. It also used an evaporative chiller, so the nighttime temperatures were used to cool water, which is a really passive system for cooling. And only then did they kind of bridge the rest of power needs with the diesel backup generator. They also had this system of transfer switches to force heating, hot water, and cooking to alternate. So only one could be powered at one time, right? So they only needed a really small diesel generator to power this whole building compared to what you might see in conventional buildings. The final strategy is around purposefully using community engagement opportunities to build social cohesion. We know we can't just have resilient buildings that keep people safe. We need neighbors to check in on one another. We need nonprofits that understand the needs of their communities. We need leaders that can mobilize people. And that all requires really high levels of community cohesion. And I think the design process is really one of those opportunities that could spark that growth. So you can use any kind of milestone in the design or construction process to foster community cohesion. It could be a community design charrette, it could be groundbreaking events, top-off events, community tree planting events. Any of those milestones you can turn into an engagement opportunity. Community engagement also affects sustainability because when you have more people involved, it makes it more likely that sustainability features stay in the project. People get attached to them and they don't let those features get valued engineered out. In terms of health, a greater understanding of the health priorities of your community allows you to, as a designer, address those health needs more specifically. So you're probably going to get better health outcomes. And in terms of equity, community engagement allows you to acknowledge local sources of experience and leadership. So you're treating people with the respect that they really deserve. The example that I've seen where this is where this has really been thought out is this Ketcham Rec Center project, which is going to be a recreation center built right next to a school. And the community engagement plan for this rec center includes really engaging older users, the expected older users of this rec center, and also the younger stakeholders at the school. So through the design process, they're trying to actually model the kind of intergenerational experiences that they're hoping will actually come to fruition when the rec center is built. This is all connected to resilience because this kind of safe engagement lays the foundation for this place to be perceived as a place of safety. When people think of, oh, I was involved in the design of that project, and now I go there after school for my after school programming, they think of it as a safe space. So when a disaster strikes, people will also naturally look there for support. Even if they don't know about all the resilience features of the building, they have an emotional connection to it. I want to be really clear that some resilient strategies don't multi-solve, and some even conflict with the goals of sustainability and health. So I have just a few examples of those. Sometimes we promote using projected temperatures to size mechanical equipment. So, and that's so that the mechanical systems that we install today can handle the increased temperature loads that we'll likely see in 5 or 10 years. But that also means that you're oversizing equipment for today's temperatures, which is inefficient and can therefore be a negative from the sustainability perspective. Resilient design can also call for using certain durable materials in some contexts. So like in flood-prone areas, you might need to use wettable materials, or in wildfire-prone areas, you might want to use fire-resistant materials like concrete blocks or metal siding. And sometimes resilient design just calls for using higher quantities of those materials, like using more concrete to strengthen structural systems. So from a sustainability perspective, those kind of materials might have higher embodied carbon, like if you're using way more concrete. Or from a health perspective, those materials might generate more toxic byproducts in the manufacturing process. So that's not necessarily a win for sustainability or health. But this is how I reconcile with that. We do at least have some strategies that multi-solve on a lot of different fronts. And for those strategies, we should be pushing those really hard because most people can see value in them from at least one angle, or they can be convinced by the cumulative impact of all those benefits. There is a big disclaimer here in that we need to do a better job of bringing these solutions to underserved or low-income communities because we won't get the equity benefits unless we do. But I do think that the resilience framework actually really helps with that latter point because inherently you need to put more concerted effort in communities that are most vulnerable to climate change. And those happen to be the most underserved. So I truly hope that the resilience framing actually helps us get better at that equity part too. Where we do see conflicts, I think we need to slow down and weigh competing interests. Just like any challenge that our industry faces, we'll find the best solutions by taking an integrated approach. And if that doesn't work, I've seen people really embrace this advocacy role more than ever before. So asking manufacturers for better products or regulators for better rules. What we can't do is give into this messaging that sustainability, health, equity, and resilience are totally different movements that inherently conflict with each other. I just don't think they do. We just haven't found the perfect multi-solving solutions yet. So that brings me to my last topic for today. I get asked a lot about scope and scale when talking about resilience. So I want to address that just a little bit. This is pulled from Boston's vision for a resilient harbor. And to me, it emphasizes that so much resilience work must be done on a district scale. So this plan calls for large infrastructure projects, big regulatory changes, and some public land conservation projects. And clearly a lot of that's out of the scope of a building practitioner. But even if we don't have control over some aspects of resilience, I do think it's still within our scope to think beyond the building in at least these 3 respects. So I'll leave you with a few stories about how I've seen that accomplished really successfully. So I'm back here with my Smothers project. I really loved that project. The school itself wasn't in the 100 or 500-year floodplain. So at first we thought we were off the hook in terms of addressing flooding here. But then we looked at a map of all the schools within the same school district, and 6 of them were in the floodplain. So we realized we might not need to flood-proof this particular school, but there is a really strong likelihood that this school may have to house all these other students during a flood who were displaced from the schools that were in the floodplain. So adaptable and flexible spaces actually became our big resilience priority rather than strict flood-proofing strategies. So that's the power of looking at buildings as a part of a networked system. In terms of looking at district scale risks and kind of zooming out from your project boundary, this is back to the Ketcham Rec Center project. And we knew that community center was going to be in an area that was highly affected by the urban heat island effect. So we were advocating for shading and cooling strategies. But that didn't seem to really resonate until we showed people that just a couple blocks away was this big highway. And we knew that on hot days, pollutants from the car exhaust would create ground level ozone, and that would persist in the lower atmosphere because of the heat. So people were really concerned about air quality problems. And once we made the connection between heat and air quality, then it made more sense to them to talk about landscaping strategies that could offer shade while cleaning the air. Finally, a really crucial part of resilience is to what extent an organization has an emergency operations plan. And of course, that's usually in the dominion of the building owner, but understanding that plan can really inform design. So this was another school that was designed to be an emergency shelter in the case of an earthquake. But it expected to serve thousands of people in the community. So the emergency plan called for using the soccer field as a campground and the gym as this big first aid center. But when the designers saw that the operational plan called for serving that many people, they knew the kitchen couldn't possibly feed that many people. So instead, the design team came up with a plan to install exterior hookups for food trucks and other kind of food, food tents and things like that. And that would vastly expand capacity. So they did. They installed these exterior potable water connections, and they installed these exterior outlets that people could just drive up and hook up to. Okay, so I'm wrapping up now. And I think what I want to get across today is that as we go into this conference, I want to encourage you to embrace the spirit of this conference, which is that our buildings can't just be green, healthy, and accessible. They have to be all of those things, and they have to offer those benefits for the long term, even when stressed by extreme events. I personally have found profound hope and reassurance that there are all these resilience strategies that have compounding benefits for sustainability, health, and equity. And to me, it proves that there might be conflicts between certain strategies, but the values that we hold, the things that we hold as the highest aim, they aren't inherently conflicting. So as you go forth into your work, I hope you'll be relentless about advocating for the strategies that you think multi-solve. I want you to be a critical sleuth about strategies that introduce conflicts and really investigate those. And then finally, I want you to make it your place to look beyond the building. You know, we have to get out of our silos and be able to look at the district scale sometimes. Okay. So that's going to conclude my presentation. I do want to say that a lot of our work at the Resilient Design Institute is developing these resilient design guidelines for cities and running resilient design charrettes for projects. So if you're interested in either of those, feel free to reach out to me. And I think we have a few more minutes for questions. Is that right, Sarah?
That's right. Thank you so much, Candace. That was a fantastic presentation and such a great way to kick off the conference and invite us all into the space of thinking about building design in this new lens or through this new lens. We have had a couple questions come in through the chat, but I would encourage anyone, if you have a question that came up for you, or if it comes up during our discussion now, please pop it into the chat and we'll make sure Candace can answer it. But to start off, knowing that policy can drive markets to change, what policies have you seen, or what policies would you recommend to encourage resilience in Vermont over the next few years?
Yeah, I love this question. This gets me into my law background. Yes, so there are really some of the kind of leading edge cities have developed really broad policy proposals that I can't say have been yet adopted, but are really inventive. So one of the ones that I think is most exciting is in Boston. And the way that Boston has rules around the fact that municipalities and cities can't adopt more stringent building codes than the state code. So they're getting around that by putting zoning overlays over the areas that they know are going to have big flooding problems. And within that zoning overlay, they're basically saying, okay, we know that our 100-year floodplain, well, let me back up. 100-year floodplains are based on historic precipitation data. So if you're trying to look at sea level rise or increased precipitation from climate change, we have to go beyond the 100-year floodplain. We have to, either go to the 500-year floodplain, or we have to do actual modeling to see what the flooding risk will be. So the way they've done that in Boston is to basically add a few feet above their 100-year floodplain regulations and made it more strict within their zoning overlay. So I think that's kind of a policy thing is, first of all, get your city to do that kind of climate projection modeling, get them to pay for that so that you actually have good data. And then secondly, incorporate it into your building codes or zoning.
Great, that's fantastic. Speaking specifically to solar electric with batteries, there's a question about how we can target the strategy as a true resilience measure when many don't believe that batteries are reliable emergency backup compared to generators. Can you speak to that issue, if that's come up in your work, or whether you've got any anecdotes on how batteries have worked in practice?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, I think people get concerned around batteries partly because of the storage potential, and maybe there's less storage potential than storing a bunch of fuel. The systems I was talking about, where you're potentially pairing a battery with a solar array and being able to island it, means that you're able to replenish those batteries. If you can completely separate from the grid, you can replenish those batteries during the day with your solar PV production. So I think it's really important to distinguish when you have a battery that's completely grid, completely grid tied, and when you have a battery that's islandable and paired with a PV array. And I think when people understand that, okay, it can be replenished if it's islandable, then that fear about is it going to be enough kind of goes away.
Yeah, that's great. And you talked about choosing accessible locations for a lot of these strategies, and the, talking about the floodplain and the climate modeling is one part of this. But can you speak more to how to prioritize if you're looking at a city and say, I know this isn't often how it happens, but say you have complete control about where you want to prioritize the next resilient building project. How do you make that choice, and what are the factors that go into that choice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do think it's we're seeing cities take the lead on doing a lot of that climate and risk assessment. So a lot of factors come into play. You want to definitely look at your climate modeling and seeing how that affects your flooding risks. And in Vermont, there's this effort now around to map our soil stability. Like we haven't even, when I showed the fluvial erosion problem, we haven't even mapped like where those could be a big risk. So a lot of this is investing in getting the data we need to do those kind of risk assessments. And from there, I talked a little bit about the resilience hub work and emergency shelters we're doing. Even if you can't, even if you know you have a super vulnerable area, even if you can't get to every single building in that area, I think it should be our #1 priority to make sure there's a resilience hub, someplace for people to go where you have really invested in resilience. And that can be this hub for the community that's most vulnerable. So I think that should be our first step, is making sure every single community that's vulnerable has a beacon of resilience inside of it.
Yeah, I like that terminology, a beacon of resilience. It really is that hope piece that people need. And I just appreciated so much that you talked about community input and community cohesion, because Vermont communities are such a key to our kind of local rural style of life. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, how important that is to our future resilience too. So a quick question about whether you've seen specific changes that happened as a result of that community input. Are there things that wouldn't have happened, you think, if that community input hadn't been there in the process?
Yeah, that is a good question. So I haven't personally been involved in a project from the community engagement point all the way through being tested in a disaster. I will say that a lot of the research around community cohesion was a result of looking at heat waves in the Chicago area, and they found that low income residents in public housing were most vulnerable and were associated with the highest fatality rates in those heat waves, except for like a little small group of buildings where community cohesion was really high. And that's because in those particular public housing projects, neighbors were checking in on each other, and they were calling the elders and seeing how they were doing, and they were bringing them water and bringing them some food and opening the windows for them. So there was actual data around like, okay, we were able to measure, we were able to see that places where people knew their neighbors and places where people could actually congregate in community spaces helped build the community cohesion that resulted in lower fatalities. So there is really good data around that. And I think we're just starting to understand how we can best do community engagement. On this topic of equity, I think there's this tendency to feel like, oh, we know how to do community engagement. We know how to get people involved. And I think we've really been shown this year that we don't, because we haven't been doing it. And we need to do better at that. And so for the leaders out there who are really investing in good community engagement, it's really a kind of a new up and coming area of expertise. So I think we need to be looking to those leaders.
Yeah, that's such an important point, that community cohesion is in and of itself a resilient strategy, and it can lead to the adoption of better resilient strategies. It's a double win. Great. I don't know how much you know about Vermont policy work and kind of the work that's going on there. So feel free to just say that this is out of your realm. But there's a question about if there are any efforts in Vermont to increase the code required foundation frost depths and to change the 100-year floodplains to more closely match the 500-year floodplain maps. Are you aware of any work being done on that area?
Yeah, I can't say I have a great answer for that. And I'm sure other people at this conference are going to be much more knowledgeable. I will say from that 2018 hazard mitigation plan that I pulled up, there was no mention of the fact that that the 100-year floodplains are historic and that we need to actually be, looking at projected data. So I really hope Vermont invests in that. And I would certainly be an advocate for that.
Yeah, it sounds like an area that more work is needed.
Yeah.
There have been a couple more questions on battery and solar. This is obviously a hot topic here and around the country right now when it comes to energy. In Vermont, often power outages happen in the snowy seasons when solar production isn't as good. Is there any way to overcome that winter issue to make batteries a more practical all-year option for backup?
Yeah, that's interesting. That also might be a technical question for some of the later sessions. I think batteries are getting better and better. I know I personally have a Sonnen battery backup, and our power outages here in Brattleboro don't tend to be super long, but we have never had a problem with our Sonnen like running out. We've always been able to bridge the outages, and I think it's been up to like a day. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear where those problems are actually coming up for people and like what the circumstances are. But yeah, I can just say from personal experience that, where if you're not experiencing super extended outages, I think our technology is actually pretty good.
Yeah. And one more question on battery storage, which is involved in the embodied carbon and the rare metals that are related to battery supply. And I think this gets into one of your conflict issues is, how do you square the benefits of batteries with some of those potential risks or damaging elements?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm really excited about is there are a few companies now that are actually looking at taking old car batteries from the electric cars and repurposing them for the kind of building storage that we're talking about. I think, someone's going to know more of the technical, benchmarks around this, but I think the battery capacity basically stalls out even like around 70% or something, and it can no longer be used for a car, but they can still be used for energy storage for buildings. So I think we need to be looking at kind of lifetime end uses and how we can repurpose some of those batteries that are going to be going into all of these EV cars quickly, and repurposing them for our buildings.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Are you seeing any insurance companies or lending institutions require resilient design and construction? That's been happening obviously in the green building space over the last 10 years. And are you seeing that switch start to happen with resilient design?
Yes, I don't know of any examples in Vermont. In some of the hurricane prone areas, the fortified rating system that I mentioned is, there are some incentives around lower insurance rates if you adopt the fortified rating system. I think it's pretty limited to around hurricane risks, and maybe flooding. But yeah, I guess I'd have to say the insurance industry has been pretty slow to do this. And from a policy perspective, I think it's because our government has said that they will bail people out. They will bail the insurance industry out if there's these big disasters. So there's not a ton of incentive for insurance agencies to be giving people breaks if they do these enhanced strategies. There are examples out there, but it's been a hard lift, and I think it goes to the fact that we need a policy change.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been some great discussion in the chat with some recommendations for Vermont to consider in terms of policy, and for some other questions. I would encourage folks to reach out to Candace with the contact information that she provided, or to look for her at other points during the conference. You said you'd be around and attending other sessions, so I definitely encourage folks to reach out. But we're going to wrap this morning a few minutes early, just to make sure that people can get to the next session on time, because I know it is a busy morning, and there's a lot of great sessions that are following this one. So thank you again, Candace, so much. That was a great way to kick off the conference. I really appreciate you being here this morning. And again, thank you all for attending our first ever virtual Better Buildings by Design. And I hope it turns out to be a great conference. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you over the next few days.
Thanks so much.